Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience. I'm Deanna Wolf, and I'm speaking with Caroline Danks today about benchmarking. This is our Let's Chat Trust Fundraising Live. So we're all here, we're all ready to go, and I'd like to welcome Caroline. How are you today?
Hi, Dee. I'm very well, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for asking me. Hi, everyone.
You're welcome. I think one of the main things that is really, really exciting of the work that you're doing is that you have put out, and LarkOwl has put out, a major benchmarking report for the last couple of years, although you've missed the last couple of years because you've had other things on the go, and you're looking to doing it again.
Yes, there's a bit of a story now. This has been sort of rumbling for many years. It's become a bit of a benchmarking saga, but I think I first had the idea to do the work in 2017, 2018. I became a freelancer in 2016, and I used I'm sure some of you will remember the old fund ratios report. And that was a very simple report that showed people what was being raised and spent on different types of fundraising. So for each fundraising discipline, there would be a simple figure. This is how much was raised. This is how much was spent. And it was averaged across the charities that participated. And I used those figures in order to make a case for some potential clients to invest in me as a fundraising consultant. I felt that it was important to be able to make the case to the board, because ultimately that was the question that I was being asked. And I realised that the figures were pretty out of date. And when I looked more deeply into the fund ratios reports, I noticed that only 17 charities had participated, which isn't enough data to be able to give a representative sample, really. It was just not helpful. So I wanted to repeat the report, and I approached the Institute of Fundraising to see if they would support the work financially, because I knew that it would take a lot of time to get the work going and to cajole people into participating, and then to getting the results together and then sharing those results. So I approached them for financial support, which they didn't want to do. And one of the reasons they gave was that they didn't feel that that data was useful if it was gathered across only 1 year. They wanted 3 years worth of data.
Okay.
So I self-funded the work and did the study in 2019, 2020, and again in 2021. So I did have, and I do have, 3 years of fundraising return on investment data as requested. And I think it's helpful in many ways.
It is. And however, a lot of that was over the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the very quick aftermath, where it was, I think, confusion is a good way to say. Chaos might be another way to say it. And we're still coming out of that, although I think it's morphed into the pandemic, or from the pandemic into a cost of living crisis, which has different impacts on it. I think similar impacts. If you've been a trust fundraiser for a while, this has got similar impacts now as to what the recession did, and the big crash in 2008. I can see similarities to it. Although I think in 2008, most organizations had a lovely buffer, and that buffer is gone this time. And so everything feels a lot stricter and restricting. So I know that you're planning on doing it again.
So yes, I have,
which is very exciting.
Yeah, I have committed to doing it again. I do think it's helpful. I do have some reservations. I think my main reservation, and how my thinking has changed since I first started doing this work, is that however often you tell people not to take these figures in isolation, people still do, and they sort of use them as a hammer with which to beat fundraisers. Sorry, that was a very violent analogy there.
No, I get you. Having been on the end of that, or the other end of it, yes.
Yeah, and that's, no matter how much you add in the caveats and you provide nuance and explanation on how to use the figures and on how not to use the figures, people they still use it as like a very blunt instrument, and that frustrates me. And I think the other issue is I think the more I work in fundraising, the more I see the value in relationships, the more I am challenged around some of the, not tropes, what's the word? Some of the norms, some of the sector norms that I've been taught and that I've come to expect, that the more I think about those, the more I question their relevance. For example, the idea of an annual gift and the idea of a 12-month cycle. A lot of trusts operate on a 12-month cycle. But if you're thinking about a philanthropist, an individual donor that's not giving through a trust, why would a 12-month cycle apply to every single individual when there are when there are circumstances and choices and things happening in that person's life that impact their ability to make a gift that have nothing to do with a certain passage of time repeating year on year on year. I'm challenging myself all the time. And I think that relationships are key. And I think that by producing these return on investment figures, I think it does reduce, I think it's reductive, and I think it reduces donor relationships and personal connections with causes that people really care about to simple figures. And I do feel uncomfortable about that. I'm still going to do the study. I still think it's valuable, but I'm going to write a lot about where I think it's perhaps not serving us as best it can, and where maybe we get it wrong in terms of using these figures to best effect.
Okay. Just as a quick aside, if anyone has, I know that we've got 12 or 13 people watching at the moment, and I'm sure lots of people will watch after this because it does stay on Facebook and it is available. It'll also be on the YouTube channel for Money Tree Fundraising. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the box underneath of our link for this, because they pop up for me and I can ask Caroline. One of the things I know we had discussed yesterday when we were planning some of this a little bit more, we discussed some things that I thought would be really important to know from a trust fundraiser's point of view. So not from senior management and not from the point of view of massive strategy, but from a trust fundraiser's point of view. What's going to be in the report that's going to be really of use to them at their level on an individual basis, or as a collective, trust fundraisers rather than charities?
So the way in which I've presented the report in the past, and the way in which I'll probably continue to do it, is to give an overall return on investment across charities. And I tend to do that broken down by size. And then I break down each discipline. So for grants, trusts and foundations, major gifts, corporates, events, legacy. So for the trust fundraiser, I'm guessing that trust fundraising figure will be interesting. And it is very much a sort of a simple figure. But what I try to do is add a bit of narrative as well. How has that figure changed over the years that I've been doing that study? And where it's most useful is if you, as a trust fundraiser, are tracking your own return on investment, which is so easy to do. You know, as an individual, you know how much you're being paid, and you can make an assessment as to how much the organization pays in overhead in order to keep you as an employee. It's not hard to do. And then you can make an assessment then. Well, it's not an assessment. You can look at the amount of money that you bring in, and you can calculate your own return on investment. If you've been at your charity for a few years, you can do that across a number of years and get a sense of how things are changing, and things will change, you know, and there's lots of things that sit outside of our control that will mean that things change for the better and for the worse. And having those figures to hand will help you in being able to make a case for perhaps more investment in the future, or they'll just simply help you to explain why your return on investment is as it is. So, for example, if you've had a massive grant over 3 years that's coming to an end, and there's nothing that you can see that's going to be able to replace that, your return on investment will likely go down a bit.
Mhm.
And so if you can explain that, then that's sort of it adds context, and it's helpful for your senior management when they are making decisions about how to organize and structure the fundraising across an organization into the future.
I think it helps too, given the fact that our lead times, once you've got the application in, can be 6. If you play, I call it the diary game. If you play the diary game, you can sort of subvert this, but not really. It's that we put our applications in and we don't see for 6 months or 12 months, or in the case of a few of them, 18 or 2 years, 18 months or 2 years. And so I think our return on investment as trust fundraisers is not a quick return. It's that slow build, and then you get to that sort of, I don't want to call it a plateau because it's not, although it does kind of plateau out, where you've built your program and it takes a while to build it, and the return on investment during that time probably isn't great. But then all of a sudden you get to a point where you can and you can predict about how much money you can bring in from year to year to year. And I think that combining that alongside the return on investment and tracking it that way can be really, really useful for an organization.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think that benchmarking as a general practice where we're looking across lots of different organizations is interesting, but it's not necessarily that helpful because of the differences between the different types of organization that are taking part. I think when you have your own figures to overlay on top of that, that's when it is really interesting. And if you have your own figures across a period of years, then that's where it becomes really, really helpful. And I think one of the biggest problems we have is the turnover in fundraising staff means that being able to track individual return on investment over a long period of time becomes impossible, really, because people move on. There are gaps in capacity, which I guess is a good reason for tracking your return on investment, because if you've got a gap in your team, if you're not making all the applications that you could be making, if you're in sort of survival mode because you're low on capacity, then that will show in your return on investment, and that is a good case for maintaining your team at a certain level. But yeah, the figures really come into their own when you do your own analysis of your own work, for sure.
And I know that for every charity there's going to be other ones which are similar in cause, in size, in location, and their general geography, whether they're close to London, whether they're close to the Central Belt in Scotland, or I don't know much about Northern Ireland fundraising and where things are. But if you're close to a centre, that means you're also close to resources, you're close to legal offices, accounting offices, charity offices when they support themselves there. And I think it's that comparing yourself to someone who is completely different. And I think a lot of the times in a lot of the benchmarking, although I know that you are trying to scatter this idea a little bit more, a lot of times in benchmarking reports, you get a small number of very large charities and they dictate for everyone, except they've got resources that are different. They've got an established trust fundraising program, so they aren't building. They don't have that. They've already reached a zenith for themselves and probably are trying to push that a little bit more, but they've got other income streams that can carry them as well. Whereas a lot of people start with trusts and foundations. So if you're going to compare like with like, I think I said to you yesterday, it's like comparing oranges and asparagus. Okay, they're both plant life and they're both fundraising, but they're not even remotely the same. If you're comparing a tiny little charity, say in Glasgow or Edinburgh, because as everyone will know probably by now, I live up in Scotland, with a massive national, almost international charity that's based out of their own offices in a high-rise building in London. It's two different creatures.
And I do hope that people aren't comparing themselves, if they are one or other of those, comparing to the polar opposite. I hope people aren't doing that, though I'm sure it does happen. we do ask in our study, we do ask people how long they've been fundraising for, because you're right, if you're building, it's very, very different to if you're kind of stable and if you're established. So we do ask people that information, and then we do try to present results for charities who are at different stages. I think that's really important. What was interesting, what we did find was, so most of the charities that participated in the last report we did had 45 participants.
That's excellent.
It is. I would like it to be more. So we had back then maybe 2,000 people on our email list, most of whom had joined because they had downloaded our report. So if we have 2,000 people respond, I think you'd have data that would be actually meaningful. 45 respondents is interesting, but it's not, you can't deduce any kind of conclusion from that. There's no scientific, you can't draw a scientific conclusion from such a small pool. But yes, I've lost my train of thought. So we do ask people about how established their programs are. And we do ask people what size the charity is. Most of the respondents were from larger charities, so 1 million plus, which, as we know, is actually the minority of charities in total across the UK.
Yes.
So most of the respondents were 1 million plus, and most of them were doing quite well. And it was frustrating because I was saying to people when I was asking people to participate, it doesn't matter where you're at. This is not a test of how well are you doing, and there's no pass mark. Like, this isn't the 11 plus, like this isn't your GCSEs. We don't mind where you're at. It's all anonymous. What's important is that we get a really broad spectrum of different charities who are at different stages, because we know that that's the reality of the sector. But it does tend to be those more established that I think are willing to make the time to do the analysis.
Do you think there's going to be room for, I know that there's some, as a trust fundraiser, when I was asked to participate in some of the surveys and things that went around, it was about my organization, and my organization didn't want to participate. But is there a way that maybe you could be measuring some of the trust fundraisers? So I could say, this is what as a trust fundraiser, this is what my success rate is. This is what my return on investment is. If it's anonymous, it doesn't matter, but it does show on a trust fundraiser by trust fundraiser basis. I know I'm asking you off the top of my head something that you may not have considered, but I'm wondering whether there's scope for something like that, where you're not responding on your company's behalf or your organization, charity's behalf. You're responding for yourself. So I'm just throwing that into the loop.
So firstly, if your organization says we're not doing this, you could still do it and no one would ever know, because I do not gather names of organizations, and the email address of someone that's participated is just it's not used. It's not, there's no way to identify unless you have a very unique fundraising situation. All you would do in that scenario is kind of skew the figures a bit, but you can answer as many or as few questions as you're able to. So there are lots of questions that some charities just can't answer because they just don't know. So ideally, if you have a full set of data and your organization's able to participate, brilliant. That makes it quite easy. And we give you all the questions in advance, so you know what we're asking. But if you can't answer a question, you can just leave it. And so if you go through the report, you'll see, I think we state on each page, this many charities answered this question, this many charities answered this question. So not every charity answers every question. So you can just go in and answer the bits that you know, and that's fine. It's not perfect. We're really not aiming for perfection, because if we were, we wouldn't have any participants. The goal is volume, and because the more people answer, the more useful the responses are.
Most definitely.
The other thing I wanted to mention, the other thing I wanted to just jump in and say about sort of the large charity versus small charity. So it is true that a charity with much bigger resources that's much bigger, more established, has that brand awareness, is likely to do better. But what we found, I can't remember which year it was, I think it was possibly 21, the most recent study that we did. Most of the charities that responded had 1 million or over. And then there were a few respondents that were the sort of super large charities, 10 million and above. By the time you get to 10 million and above, your return on investment drops overall.
Ooh.
Yeah, because you're just so massive. You just cost a load more money than a charity that's smaller and a bit more agile and probably watching the pennies a lot more carefully than the bigger charities are. And I've worked in charities of all sizes, and that certainly feels like a truth there. You know, in my experience, the bigger charities will spend money on things that a smaller charity would never, ever even entertain spending money on, because they're just, it's just a resource question, isn't it? So yeah, by the time charities get really, really, really big, the return on investment across all fundraising areas tends to drop, probably because they're doing more individual giving, and it seems to be only the big charities now that are doing direct mail, which is very, very costly. I guess still produces a return, but will bring down the overall figures because the return on investment is considerably lower than many other types of fundraising.
For a lot of trust fundraisers, our main the metric that we often use to figure out whether we're doing well or not is our success rate. How many applications does it take for you to get from zero to getting an application in? How many times, or getting an award in? Is that something that is covered? I haven't looked at the report in a while, but is that something that you're going to be covering? Because I think that's a personal metric that I think a lot of us manage, and it takes into effect do you have the right projects to fundraise for, which it all comes down to. If you don't have great projects, it's going to be really hard to fundraise for them. But are you choosing the right funders to apply to? Are you doing good applications? And that's what brings it in.
Yeah, we do ask people to report on success rates. Yeah, and I think we ask them to report per quarter or for the last quarter, because there's that time lag, isn't there? Which is annoying, and then it's difficult to report on. So we just draw a line and say, just submit your figures for this period, and if enough people do it, we'll get a sense of what the sector looks like as a whole. But yeah, I mean, think so.
We've had one question come in, and I'm sorry, the names don't come through into the service that we're using to broadcast this, so that we can have the conversations. One of the questions is, hello, sorry if I missed this earlier. What formula do you use to calculate return on investment in trust fundraising? We didn't talk about that. Do you use a formula?
It's just really simply, how much did you raise divided by how much you spent. So if I've raised £100,000 and I cost £10,000, then the ratio is £10 for every £1 spent. And it's that simple. I get lots of finance people emailing me actually asking about the formula, and like, I don't know.
And it's basic division?
That's what I do. And yeah, it's very simple. It's intentionally simple. I'm not a mathematician, but I'm also not interested in knowing any detail beyond that simple ratio. So yeah, how much did you raise and how much did you spend? And yes, it includes staff costs. Of course it includes staff costs, because if it didn't, the figures would be misrepresentative of the reality. I had one year a charity put in their figures for their corporate fundraising, and they had invested 30,000 and they'd raised nothing because they just made the investment. And of course that skewed the figures, because not everybody does corporate fundraising. So your sample is smaller anyway. And then you've got this kind of one charity that's made the investment but hasn't seen any return yet. And I think I don't include in the final report, I don't include something like the top 10% and I don't include the bottom 10%. But I did mention it as an aside and just said, look, this person has put this in, and I think it's admirable that charities are investing in new areas, and only by investing in new areas will we know what works. We have to be willing to experiment, but it can feel risky. But it was lovely to see an example of a charity doing that and then sharing that in a sector-wide report.
I think it's really important too to realize that an investment can take time to give you a return. So an investment this year of £30,000, you may not see that return for another 3 or 4 years, and that's just going to be because that's the nature. If you were investing in stocks or shares, it could be that you don't gain any investment in the short term. It's always a long term. It's not buying a service, it's investing in a service. And I think that we need to start, as fundraisers, we need to start using those kinds of language. We've just got I've got two things to say. We've got one last question, and I've got another final question for yourself. The follow-up question, if that's okay, I'm reading directly to what this person has written, is
Okay.
if a grant of, say, 150k is awarded over 3 years, would you ask fundraisers to consider 50k of income in the year, or the whole 150k which they've raised, but not all coming in during the year the costs are incurred? I think that depends on myself. I think that depends on how your finance accrues. Your finance team accrues grants coming in.
Yeah. So how would you present that in your annual report? And then correspondingly, we would invite you to submit the figures as you would do for your annual report, because even multi-year grants aren't all the same, trusts are so wildly disparate and different in the way that they operate. There'll be some trusts that will make a pledge over 3 years, but there's work to be done each year in order to secure that pledge. So,
and your report gets you the next installment. You don't automatically get that installment.
Exactly. And then there's resource that is taken up through that reporting process in the corresponding year. So it's a really good point. And actually, I've never given specific instruction around multi-year gifts. I think I will now. So thank you. I appreciate this. I think I would suggest that you consider just the amount that's coming in that year. And this, I guess, is why it's important to do these studies year on year on year. It has. Yeah, that's my instinct. I'm happy to be challenged on it, because you're right. The work that goes into securing a multi-6-figure, multi-year grant is massive upfront. And then the benefits of that are felt down the line. But then it's likely that the year after you'll be doing some kind of similar large grant. It sort of all evens out in the end. So yeah, my instinct would be just report on the amount that comes in for that year. But yeah, challenge me.
I think it's going to depend as well what the charity SORP says, and I think they're revising the charity SORP this year for the accounting side of things. So there's lots going on. My final question to you is, what piece of advice would you give to a trust fundraiser about success rates and returns on investment? And would you give the other half of that question is, would you give the same advice to senior management?
Yeah, I would. I think the advice, I don't think I would give any advice around success rates or return on investment, because I don't think, for the most part, those are dependent upon things that we can't really control. So my advice would be, are you confident that your fundraising practice is as good as it can possibly be? Do you know what it is you need to be doing to ensure that you're giving yourself the best possible chance of success? If you do know what you're doing, great, do it. And don't worry about the success rates, because you can't really control them. What you can control is the actions and the activities that you do every day to move yourself towards those grants and those gifts. And that is the same advice that I would give to senior managers. don't worry about success rates and return on investment, because that's not something you can control. Are you confident that your staff have the skills, the knowledge, the ability, the support to be able to do the best fundraising that they can do? Because if you're doing all the right things and you're doing enough of them, and your work isn't being crowded out by other things that are not directly related to fundraising, then the success, it will come. Maybe not in the volumes that we've seen in the past, but it will come.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and pushing through the technology issues that were going on. What I would like to do is invite everyone, when you see the request to come and fill out the benchmarking report from LarkOwl and from Caroline, please do join in, encourage your managers and other fundraising teams in your organization to respond as well, not just yourself. But if they're not willing to, as Caroline said, go in and put some information in. You might be only able to answer the trust fundraising side of things as a trust fundraiser, but do that, because the more information that goes in, the more that we can all use that and get a good idea of where we sit within our own stratosphere or our own levels, based on the types and size of our own charities and where we're based. So thanks very much, Caroline. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Dee. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for hanging around and listening to this. It's been really nice. Thank you.
Great. For everyone who's listening in, our next session is going to be in September. We take the summer off. We don't do it because a lot of people take time off during the summer for their families and children. And a lot of us are often very, very busy in the summer as a result. So we will see you again in September. Keep an eye out on Trust Fundraising Hub for the next date. And I wish you well. And please do fill in that report when it comes through and the questionnaire. Thank you.